Bucks is here and he's fired up. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Kano. Yeah, we're going to jump into Buck Stops here now. And I want to kick off with heart and soul players. We saw Brisbane take on Melbourne. Max Gawn went down, but Dane Zorko came back. And I just think that that's something that we love to see in our own teams, and it's something we saw on the weekend. It's very early in the season, so you can get good performances and bad, and the swings and the highs and lows are considerable. And Brisbane's were. Their first round was really poor. Their second round was excellent. And maybe it coincides with the return of a Dane Zorko, who I believe is a heart and soul player for Brisbane, and he was excellent. But there was no doubt that the Melbourne team was affected by the worst possible scenario of Max Gawn. The look on his face, the look on on the interchange bench at the end of the first quarter. Mark Williams,
Even Choco was flat. What was it? You can't shut him up, and even he didn't look like he was up and about.
Well, he was sitting back in the dugouts, and he was flat as. The coach looked flat, like there was a general malaise across the Demons players. And when you're so invested in those guys, I think it does have an effect. So I think we saw that to some extent. So who are yours? And keep an eye on those going forward.
Just on Zorko, he did an interview with Triple M pre-game, and I was really fascinated by what he had to say.
Yeah, and just quickly on that, the more I go on, the more I wonder if you try and dumb down these irregular and sharp edges of your personality and of your psyche, do you actually take away what makes you great? So Dane Zorko has carried this, like a chip on his shoulder throughout his whole career, and he's been very successful from it. And every now and then he steps over the line, but I don't want him to smooth his rough edges out, because I think we get the best out of him, and I think it's true of all of us. We've got to embrace our imperfections at some, but it's good to see that he's prepared to work on it, and hopefully it just continues to become a strength. In the same vein, my second point is that I think Geelong will be okay. I don't think that there's any reason to panic, and I don't think their coach is either.
Does it mean, though, that you still ask questions about, like, when you say they're going to be okay, but do you sweep that under the carpet and just go, it'll turn, we'll be okay? Or would they be concerned about, because they do look slow through the midfield. They got some players that aren't impacting like they were last year, clearly. I don't think they're anywhere near as hungry as what they were towards the back end of the last year, where they were just smashing teams and beating up on teams.
Correct.
And defensively, they were really strong. Now they're not, but you're right, because they've got Gold Coast, Hawthorn, West Coast the next three. They're going to be 3-2, and in 3 weeks' time, we're going to be not talking that much about Geelong. But it's not to say there aren't a few deficiencies in the game.
And when they go and play at home, talking about negative momentum and positive momentum in games is huge. Momentum in season is huge. I think Geelong have a competitive advantage being able to go down. They're one of the few. They're the only Victorian club with a home ground advantage, largely. So they do get that. They've taken full toll on that. But the point being about their heart and soul players, there's no Joel Selwood there. And I think Tom Stewart is probably their next heart and soul guy that just holds them together, the glue out the back, probably with Cam Guthrie. I don't think Dangerfield, even though he's their skipper, I don't think he's a heart and soul player for them. So they're still working out what life after Joel Selwood's going to be. And I reckon they've lost the next guy in Tom Stewart who draws them together like that. So there's a bit of a dynamic bit of growth that needs to happen there as well. And that's not guaranteed, but I believe that in good organisations in their capacity to get that done. Talking about growth and connection and finding the most of what you've got, the Saints have been huge. Ross Lyon's imprint is really clear, but it's their and the defensive numbers jump off the page.
Through the roof.
They've only had 7 goals kicked against them from turnover in 2 games, which you expected. But what we didn't expect was how effective their front six has been, and they've been brilliant in the first 2 weeks. So yes, Max King is that, and Tim Membry is that, and Jack Higgins is that and was that. In the first 6, 7, 8 games of 2022, St Kilda's forward efficiency was through the roof. Those 3 blokes, King, Membry and Higgins, when the ball went to them, they were in the top 10 for scoring goals from being targeted inside 50. Philippou wasn't on a list that time last year. And he's in 2 games he stood up. He's kicked three goals in the weekend. Caminiti wasn't on the list, and he wasn't on the list till a couple of months ago. Cordy had never played forward. And he kicked 2 goals. And Gresham, they're getting the base out of. So
is it sustainable? Is this style sustainable?
With attitude, with high attitude and effort and intensity, and Ross talks about that flat out. So he coaches that flat out. Yes, it is.
But yes, is it unrealistic? And we've seen even Brisbane in round 1, when they were a fraction off, they got smashed. How do you replicate that for such a long season? So my fear for St Kilda is, and it's a glass half empty approach on what should be full, because what they've done is extraordinary. And I see it a little bit with Adelaide. I admire greatly how Adelaide play, but they struggle to do it for 4 quarters because of the taxing nature of the way that is to win. At some point, they're going to have to find another way to win, and that would be my fear for Ross and the Saints.
Well, the reason it's sustainable for Ross is because it will always be built on solid defence. That and they're not actually relying on that high pressure game that has been his DNA. They're ninth for pressure differential, so they're not putting over the top pressure on the opposition, and they're absorbing it pretty well. It's just their really solid defensive profile. They've got players that have a dip, and St Kilda have traditionally been a side, even under Alan Richardson and Brett Ratton, quite high pressure, high intensity side. They're great runners apparently, so that's coming to the fore. But yeah, it's unconventional, but it's heading in the right direction.
This week, good game.
Oh yeah, because they've been excellent as well. The next one I want to talk about is a new position in footy. We talk about quarterbacks all the time and blokes that set up the play, but it's specifically the 6th defender that plays closest to the midfield. I think that this position is redefining in modern footy and the way that we're seeing the attack control defence in the early stages of this year and last year. And I think that we're seeing this position and the person who plays this be so important in any team's makeup. It's Nick Daicos going into that grab, but he is one of the players that I reckon is doing it. I reckon it started, we were talking about Bevo and his bona fides as a coach. I think it started with Matthew Boyd, who needed to work out of the midfield, and he's played as that aggressive 6th defender off back of stoppage.
Did it start before that? I remember having to tag Andrew McLeod as a defensive half forward, and McLeod went to half back, and he was doing that. And this was sort of early 2000s, 07, 08-ish era. So
well, there's always been attacking defenders, but
is this defender worrying that? So has the change been that this defender is not really even worrying about an opponent?
That's the thing. I think he's just another midfielder, and I think that Matty Boyd did it. Caleb Daniel was another that basically ran away from his opponent, let him in like behind him, and he would go up to stoppage. So I think they were the 2 that did it. I think Jack Chris was one that came through. Burn Jones for Port was one. Jake Lloyd for Sydney. He's really aggressive. Lockie Whitfield, get the ball in their hands and use it off the back, but also basically become another midfielder. But what Collingwood are doing with Nick Daicos or Jack Chris or Scott Pendlebury's even playing that role periodically, it's just another midfielder. And they're backing their back 5 behind them to really get the job done. Sheasel's been played in that role for North in some shape or form. Sinclair's always played it for St Kilda. And I think we saw, like late last night, with the shift in plan from West Coast Eagles, Jermaine Jones was a player that played that role. I'm running aggressively off the back.
So if your team doesn't have one, and you mentioned Burn Jones, but he's not really playing the role as effectively as the others, you're at a big...
He's not as skillful, but he's a hard-nosed ball winner.
He might be playing that role, but he's not doing it as effectively as the other names. If you don't have a player playing that role, you're at a significant disadvantage.
I believe so. Yeah. And if you don't, if you can't create a player there and a structure that supports his aggressive intent. So I think that Adam Sard for Carlton should be released from defending and actually put into this role. I think it would help Carlton even more to be to give their forward half even more access. And Sard potentially didn't have the tank for it 2 or 3 years ago, but I reckon he might
We
now.
might ask John Longmire about that because Nick Blakey has all the weapons to be the best at it with Nick Dacos in the game, I reckon.
Well, and the other thing is you can't rely on one. You sort of, if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 blokes that are bouncing off, well, then that bloke's even more dangerous. The last one I want to go to is just the performance of the North Melbourne in and under midfielder, one of the most influential players over the last 12 games in terms of stats and impact, and that's Davies-Uniacke. Clarko's wrapped. Like they've done what Collingwood have. The first 2 games less than 6 points, less than a goal, wins, won the close ones, and we'll talk more about that last kick at some point. But LDU's performances have been through the roof, and this is a kid who 2 years ago the club were working out how they were going to get the best out of him. He was not performing well in the twos, and there was thoughts that they had a bust on their hands with an early selection.
They thought LDU might be a bust.
Yeah, and it was around his anxieties, it was around his expectations on himself, his capacity to actually become the professional or understand what he needed to do as a professional to then be able to go and make the most of his talent. And there's no guarantee that players get through that, and players come through it at different rates if they do. So it might be mental and emotional maturity as much as it is physical maturity, but clearly it's all come together for this kid, and North Melbourne are the beneficiaries of it, and it's all credit to him and them for being patient enough and working through the hardship to be able to get to this point. His first 2 games, so he's had 30 touches each of the first two rounds. He's an equal handball and kicker because his contested work inside is so good. He's had 10 clearances and 11 clearances. He's had 5 tackles and 6 tackles. So he gets to work in the harder elements of the game.
Goals.
He's had 5 or 6 inside 50s. He's averaged, and he's kicked a goal a game. I mean, there's not many players in the comp. There's players that are winning more footy, but there's not many players that are as impactful. And when you've got that, he was in a team with a 2-win season, but still took steps forward. And now there's a little bit more happening around him, and we're going to see the best of him. You were suggesting that someone would play like Lee Matthews? It's not him.
Oh no, it's not him. I think Nick Dacos's low centre of gravity is Lee Matthews-esque. From what I've seen, Lee Matthews, the vision you see, he picks the ball up and he's able to sort of spin in a phone box, and he doesn't lose his feet. I'm not suggesting they're the same player, but there's
a bit hippie as well.
Lee Matthews' qualities. Nick, they would be about the same height, I imagine. Perhaps Nick's a little bit taller, but their agility, low centre of gravity, and the ability to not fall over was who I was likening to Lee Matthews. It's a big call, I know. But Luke Davies-Uniacke, 6 Brownlow votes already. And can I just add Nick Larkey? Because I was looking at his numbers on Friday, and he'd either kicked big bags or it wasn't much after that. The in-between stuff, I see he's got to bridge the gap between. I want to see some 2s and some 3s from Larkey. When he's not kicking 5s and 6s, it can't be 1 or none. So to then see him back it up after 6 in round 1, go on a tough road trip against a very good defence and kick 4, big tick for him as well.
Oh yeah, I got a text from his manager, Rob Durazio, as I was talking about him, and I wasn't aware, but that Luke lost his old man a couple of years ago, and how tight they were. And I reckon it sort of just reinforces my point of patience and time, and to try and not to judge or to stereotype anyone too early, especially young men that are playing in a public. They're trying to ply their trade in a public sphere. And he was. I remember when he was drafted, he was seen as he's a surfy kid. He doesn't really love footy, but he's pretty good at it. But when you go through something like that, you can only. A lot of the listeners, a lot of us would know when someone's taken away from you that you've got that affinity with that really gets you. It takes time, and he would still be dealing with it now. And maybe he's playing for his old man, but I just think it's just great to see young men come to hand. It's great to see them blossom and find themselves. And sometimes trauma and struggle does that for us, whether it's in a professional sense or in a very personal sense, but. in any event, what he's doing is amazing, and you just love to see young people, putting their best out in the park and being rewarded for it.
69-minute final quarter at the Gabba on Friday night. The power outage, of course, which has been well discussed, saw two light towers lose power, halting play with 12 minutes to go in the game. It resumed approximately 40 minutes later after half-time, and something unforeseen happens like that, be it an earthquake or bad weather or lights go out. Shouldn't just be the team that's in the lead gets the win?
Yeah, well, if any result looked like it was done,
that one
was done. But I made the comment. I said, well, I would just call it because the percentage is somewhat set. It's not going to change too much. And then, 12 minutes later, Brisbane have had 13% shaved off that result into what will become their percentage at the end of the year. But that was what we saw was stark, wasn't it? Like it probably said. For me, it said a fair bit about Melbourne's lack of intensity prior to that. And they came out and said it had a real crack at it. But then it also, as Chris Fagan alluded to, Brisbane felt like they didn't get all the information to get themselves prepped up for that last 12 minutes. It's a bizarre situation. But I actually thought, broadcasting it was weird. The rules are there. It's not as if when you get to a situation like that, you don't want to just be making it up. So the rules are there for a reason. Now, if the rules aren't right, then adjust them. But to say you've got 60 minutes to finish the game, that's fair enough. The fact it was a night game, it was only 9:45 in Brisbane, even though it was 11:15 in Melbourne. So it wasn't late up there. And you're really thinking about the spectators as much as you're thinking about that are actually at the venue as much as anyone. And then the communication of the same. So the AFL had made the rules. They followed it through. I thought it was done relatively effectively.
Have you say on that? Join in the conversation, 1300 736 736. It was a weekend of drama. The AFL's ticked off on the decision to not award a free kick for insufficient intent in the dying moments of the North Melbourne win over Fremantle. So we know the AFL released a statement yesterday. Feels to me like the AFL tick off on every controversial thing and that they think that they get it right.
That's a blanket statement, though. Do you think they're right?
Well, the audio... And we played it on... So the audio that the AFL supplied, we played on the Sunday Footy Show yesterday, and the panel was in unanimous agreement that the siren had gone after the ball crossed the line. But then I'm confused. Then there's a different version of the audio. So I'm not sure whether the one we were given...
Do you reckon you can move the sound of a siren on an audio?
I don't know.
I reckon you could. So you don't know... That could happen. What I can't comprehend is so the siren can already have gone and someone can be 55 metres away from goal, have a shot at goal.
And it goes through.
It actually hits the contest and then goes over the goal line. Exactly. And it could be up to a minute after the siren's gone and that score counts, right? But then the ball needs to be out of play before you can make a decision on whether it's deliberate or whether it's so. Those two parts of the field are treated entirely differently: the scoring zone and the boundary line. I would have thought that whatever action takes place during the time of the game can be adjudicated. It shouldn't be where the ball is. So I would have. I think the AFL got it right as the rule is written, if in fact the ball was still in play. But I think that should have been a free kick. I think that the rule should be rewritten, that if the act or the decision has been already made, if the bit of play has already taken place and then the siren comes after, then you can still make the decision.
I think that's a pretty good summary. So there's no criticism towards the umpiring and the decision they made on the night, but is the rule right? That was prior to the result yesterday against Sydney. The question has never been, and I don't think anyone's suggesting that the players and the coaches aren't trying to win. The question is, has the changes they've made it impossible for that team to be competitive? That's the question and that's the debate. Because I look up this morning and Hawthorn's percentage is 42. Sydney's is 232 on the back of that result. Now, to put that in perspective, North's percentage last year after winning 2 games was 55. So they're 13% better than Hawthorn right now.
It's a very small sample in two
Yeah,
games.
correct.
But the word tanking.
Different forms of tanking.
Yeah, I understand. No, there's only one form of.
What's your
my
one
form of tanking is that you're not trying to win.
The players.
Yes. Yeah, so in that moment that you actively make decisions, whether under the surface or obvious, to not do your best. And I don't think Hawthorn can be. That's absolutely bullshit.
No, I agree with that version, but I think there's different versions of tanking.
No,
because if you put a full forward at full back, he's going to try, and he's not a full back, then that's not giving your team the best chance to win.
Yeah. Okay. Look, let's do this. Let's do this. Who does it say more about? Carlton and Geelong on the Thursday night game. Who does that say more about that result?
I've got not any concern about Geelong, so I'm going to say Carlton for the way that they were able to move the ball faster. They were so slow in the opening round, so the adjustments that the coaches made there, the midfield was back to its brutal best, and they've got maybe the best player in the game by the end of the year, Charlie Curnow, fit and firing and looking good. I still think Mackay is well off his best. So I walked away from that game thinking, okay, that's what I wanted to see. From Carlton to you, the Brisbane and Melbourne game. Who does it say more about?
I think it says more about Brisbane and their top end ability, and what it does say a lot about is how important attitude and effort is, because they were way off in the second half against Port Adelaide. But I think it says a lot about Brisbane's top end and what they can do with that midfield dominance into their forward line. I'm not that worried about the Demons, although they've been one on, one off, both of those teams, and they're supposed to be top four sides. Collingwood, Port.
Well, we knew Collingwood were good, and they solidified that. So it says more about Port Adelaide. Their inability to defend the high ball going inside 50 was always going to be my concern coming to the season. Jonas is the captain. Unusual to say this about him, but he was uncompetitive. Aaliyah was well beaten, and it was far too easy. So Ken Hinkley would walk away going, there's not one aspect of that game that I thought we did well. Smash contested, smash ground ball, smash from stoppage. Couldn't compete in the air defensively, didn't bring the attitude and intensity. So a pretty depressing day if you were Port Adelaide. It says more about them. Adelaide lost to Richmond by 32 points despite a significant third quarter comeback. Who does that result say more about?
I think it says more about the Tigers. I reckon that was more the Tigers of old. They handled the opposition's best, and then they ran away with it in the end. And there were some experienced players that really stood up in those moments. But there was a couple of young guys that came through as well. So that's their trademark. That put the opposition under fierce pressure, absorb their best punch, and then run away from them at the end. So I thought that was a really strong performance by the Tigers, and because I think Adelaide's best is pretty good, and Nick's has spoken about that quite often. Western Bulldogs and St Kilda.
Well, when you have as much talent in the team as what you have got, and you're playing against a side in St Kilda that didn't play finals last year and sacked its coach, and you manage 41 points, it says more about the Western Bulldogs. And a whole heap of questions that we've put on the radar, and I wrote about it in The Age on Thursday. Can't defend, can't halt opposition momentum, queries over the fitness levels of the club, and Luke Beveridge spoke about that after the game, and I think some of the numbers back that up. So the prospect of them going 0-6 with the draw that they've got is very real now, and in terms of coaches that are under pressure, he would be one of those. Fremantle and North Melbourne. Would you believe North Melbourne won by a point?
Yeah, and I think it says more about Freo.
Yes.
I think they're the latest adopters in the more aggressive offence. I know Longy really well, and he's quite structured and methodical in the way that he wants the game plan built, and that's been a strength of his and of Fremantle's. But I think that there's room for some run and gun, and West Coast showed, and we'll get to them. But West Coast showed how quickly you can change that. But yeah, I think it says a bit about Freo, and I'd suspect that the coaching group would be sitting around over the next couple of days assessing how they can open their game up a little bit more.
Didn't they have the whole of the off-season to do that?
Yeah, of course you do. But you don't he's spoken about it too, about being more expansive and taking more chances, but it's nearly you become risk averse at times, and that's more in the energy that and the space that the players are living in, rather than the isolated decisions. But yeah, something needs to be freed up there. So I reckon it says a bit about Freo.
Just
Sydney v Hawthorn. Who does that say more about, Kano?
Hawthorn, because the prospect of waking up last week and this week, knowing how long a year it's going to be, for Sam Mitchell, the challenge to keep this group motivated. And I don't know, I've never coached, but how you do that at round one. Now, what are they going to do? Do they really review it hard, and does he take a negative lens on it when you lose by 81, or does he go more positive and look? I don't know what he's going to do, but it's going to take all of his coaching strengths to keep this group motivated. Essendon beat Gold Coast by 28 points. What does the result say?
Yeah, I'm going to say the Bombers, and they've really exceeded everyone's expectations, I would have thought. But they've kicked 100 points 2 weeks in a row. They've actually defended pretty well also. Their run and gun style, their handball receives, and their willingness to go forward fast. I mean, they've always been seen as when they're playing to their capacity, that they're a great offensive side. But we're seeing sort of fantastic transition, and the balance of both. I mean, they're going from their D50 to their forward 50 over 1 in 3, which is a great a great trait to have. And they're defending ball movement okay. I mean, they're in high transition games, but they've been able to score heavily. And there's a question mark on who they've played, but I just really like what Essendon have done. So for me, that's a big tick for them.
I think you're right, and just on that, often we can be critical of coaches and decisions that they make. I thought Brad Scott had a great week, and I'll tell you why. His refusal to play Jake Stringer was a great decision. He was fit to play, past fit. He said, nah, he's not ready. So I'm not doing what we've done in the past and rushing him back in. He can go play in the VFL, and got through with 3 quarters and did it well. And I hope he stays there for at least another week. So there was one. He identifies that McGrath's a half back after him being thrown everywhere, wing, half forward on ball. He's a half back, and his performance yesterday was terrific. Langford as a forward, we got 5 goals out of that. So that with the injuries, the move there, and putting Dylan Shield back inside. Dylan Shield is a good footballer. For whatever reason, he was forced out of the midfield and went to half forward, and he looked lost. Identify your strengths of your players, getting back on ball, and his numbers were huge yesterday, Dylan Shield. So very good week for Brad.
And Redmond's been a fantastic player off the back. And when they weren't performing well last year, he was one that stood up and played with real energy and commitment. Last game, West Coast or GWS, who does it say more about?
I think it says more about West Coast, because I was concerned that they'd thrown the towel in and given up. And from what I saw yesterday, they hadn't. So to see that, okay, these are good footballers that still have a competitive edge to them, and they still have the pride in their performance. And Tim Kelly was one of those players who got back to his best, but there were others yesterday for West Coast. It was a tough, hard performance, and one that they desperately needed when their club was under fire.
That was a really stark difference in the way. Now, whether they've been practicing it and weren't able to execute last week against North, or whether it was a complete shift in attitude, but that's the most metres they've gained by handball since 2017. So 6 years since they've played with that run and gun style, and the best they've moved the ball statistically since 2019. So it's going back away, and with some some new names there, some older guys, but some new names that are playing important roles, and Jermaine Jones being, probably front and centre in that, with, then the amount of handball receives and inside 50s, he was fed the ball. So it was great to see that change and that shift.
Kane.